When I was growing up as a little Jewish girl, the last place I thought I'd be on a Sunday in October is here talking to you about this. First of all, I'd like to thank you for having me, because even after I came out, I would have never expected to be in front of a church telling my story, much less having been invited and welcomed here. What you're doing is immensely important. And from the brief experience I've had here, I'm very proud to be speaking with such an open-minded, affirming, accepting group of people. If you missed it, my name is Theo Zelkind. I am 16 and I'm transgender. I've never really been what anyone would describe as mainstream. When I was little, I would always choose Transformers over Barbies, a good wrestle over a tea party, and no one, and I mean no one, could put me in a dress. Now, this is not to say that all girls who like cars and pants are transgender, but this was just the first of many signs that I might be different. Then, in kindergarten, as soon as I had a say in what I looked like, I cut off all my hair. Right around then, people started mistakenly calling me he, and I hated correcting them, not because it was an awkward conversation, because I can usually joke my way out of anything, but because I felt like I was lying to everyone I corrected. In second grade, I even asked my mom to start buying me Batman underwear from the boys section. The next big thing for me was when I was ashamed to go to the bathroom at school in around fourth grade. I'd walk into the girls' bathroom sporting my basketball shorts and short hair, and at the very least I'd get a weird look. But more likely was that someone would run out screaming or tell a teacher, and I'd have to half-heartedly explain to an adult that I was a girl and in the right bathroom, even though I don't think I really believed it myself. What really made me understand that there may be a bigger issue at hand than just basketball shorts and short hair was that in the fifth grade, in an attempt to make myself more inconspicuous and get some bullies off my back, I redid my whole wardrobe. I got girls' pants, so many shirts with the word fabulous on it, girls' swimsuits, and even the unthinkable. I bought a pink shirt. I began having severe panic attacks that left me incapacitated. With the help of my mother, we deduced that this all started happening when I changed my clothes, and maybe I should just wear what made me comfortable. I had an idea then that I might be transgender, but I didn't really have a word for it. The first time I heard the word transgender was just before middle school, and I immediately connected to it. For the first time, I felt like I'd found my people. I've been fortunate to have an easy, accepting coming out and transition process with just a couple of exceptions, the most difficult of which being my father. I had already come out to my mom, my siblings, and several friends, and I was even on track to start testosterone, but my therapist said she wouldn't be able to write a letter recommending me to start my transition or even continue to see me without both guardians' consent. So one day, I sat my dad down in his closet. I didn't see the irony of that until I wrote this speech. And I told him that I was transgender. I wanted him to use he, him pronouns when referring to me, and that I needed him to sign off on my medical transition. He said he didn't believe that I was transgender, telling me that I was just a tomboy and that I'd grow out of it eventually and be a normal girl. He compared it to how he's always wanted to be taller, but he never stuffed his shoes or anything. He invoked Judaism in order to call me an abomination. His words, not mine. Even when I told him through a sea of tears that I was really depressed and this was the way to help me, it was not enough to change his mind. Needless to say, I was shocked. I knew how difficult coming out could be, and I knew that my dad was fairly conservative, but even still, you never really expect it to happen to you. I called my mom in tears, and in therapy the next week, I discussed my options with my therapist. She said that the only way to medically transition without my dad's consent would be to become emancipated. For those of you that don't know, when a minor is emancipated, they legally become an adult by proving they are capable of living on their own, which would give me the ability to sign off on my own transition without my dad's permission. At this point, I was depressed, severely suicidal, and beyond ready to do whatever it took to not be stuck in the wrong body anymore. So I started talking to lawyers. My mom urged me to give my father another chance, because he's my father after all, but I wasn't feeling particularly forgiving yet. So my version of a second chance was more of a warning. I told him if he didn't get on board, I was going to get emancipated and I wouldn't see him anymore. I know this may seem harsh, but I'm an independent guy, and I was very aware that if I continued being in an environment that didn't allow me to be me, I wasn't going to survive. It took him about a month of therapy to come around, but he eventually started using my preferred pronouns and calling me Theo. My father's use of religion to deny my identity hurt me very badly, and it made me question God. Why would any God make me like this if he thought I was an abomination? I struggled with questions like this one for a while, but what really got me out of my funk was my best friend Megan and her family that live across the street from me. They are some of the most religious, devout Catholics I've ever met, and they'd always remind me that even Jesus himself would spend his time with outcasts, lepers, moneylenders, and that he teaches to love everyone and to treat everyone with respect. And I truly don't believe that there is an asterisk next to everyone. There is no qualification of everyone. Coming out to my friends was mostly pleasant. My two favorite responses were my friend Katie, who responded, "Who knows already, so I know who to not so politely correct." I cleaned that up a bit because there were some well-meaning expletives in the original. And then my friend Quinn, who said, "Oh, finally, I thought I was going to have to tell you." But then there was another friend of mine who responded with one word that felt like a baseball bat to the gut. Why? I didn't know what to say. I thought, do I need a reason? More importantly, do I have the right one? I was at a complete loss for words, and I don't remember exactly what I said back then, but my answer to her now would be, why aren't you? Not in the juvenile, I know you are, but what am I sense, but imagine that you are you, exactly the way you are. You have the same favorite color, favorite food, everything, but one big difference. You were born in the body of the opposite sex. For instance, if you are a woman and identify as such, you are you with all of your hobbies and interests, and you feel like a woman, but you are in a man's body. That's really the closest I can explain what being transgender feels like, and there's still quite a bit more to it. But even still, I didn't let the more negative experiences negate the positivity and love that surrounded me. Coming out has taught me a really important lesson. People aren't permanent. The good and the bad come and go, but the only person you're guaranteed to spend the rest of your life with is you. It's taught me that the only opinion that really matters is my own and God's, because ultimately, those are the only two opinions that can make any sort of change. All of this is not even close to the end of the journey for me, because there is still that voice scratching at the back of my mind, just full of bitterness that I missed a decade and a half of being a boy, and that no matter what, I'll still never be the right kind of boy. And those are the kinds of thoughts that I live and deal with every day. And there really isn't a magic cure, not even coming out. But what makes it exponentially easier is knowing that I can't change the past, but I get to spend every day of the rest of my life being who I am. And now some information for you, the majority of the population, cisgendered people, or people whose identity is parallel to the sex they were assigned at birth. People always feel compelled to ask questions about what stage people are in their medical transition. While that is an understandable response, it makes the person you're asking uncomfortable and is just kind of an inappropriate question. So I'll give you some general information that will hopefully satisfy your curiosity. Each transition is a very personal process, and there is no right or wrong way to do it. Some people go on hormones and some don't. Some people get surgery and some don't. Another thing is that gender identity and sexual orientation are two completely separate things. Gender identity is who you are and what you feel like, and sexual orientation is who you love. Being trans does not make a person gay, straight, or anything in between, and vice versa. Your sexual orientation does not dictate your gender identity. When I sat down to write this speech, I had a really hard time starting because there are so many aspects of being transgender and supporting transgender people that I couldn't decide what to talk about. But then I realized something very important. No matter how hard I try or how much I want to, there's no possible way I can be the spokesperson for the entire transgender community. I've shown you my experience, one of about 1.5 million transgender people in the US alone. And if I could leave you with one thing, it would be this. Don't stop with me. Keep researching and talking about these issues. Keep talking to people in the community. Keep doing these amazing things that you've already been doing. And most importantly, love each other. Because really, that's all anybody's looking for. Thank you, and God bless you.
He's a tough act to follow, eh? Joseph Campbell wrote, "We must be willing to get rid of the life we've planned as to have the life that is waiting for us." Theo was about 3 years old when I would place him in the shopping cart basket at the grocery store, and he would nonchalantly mention to strangers that passed by, "I'm a boy from Africa." When I mentioned it to a friend, she insisted that he must have been a boy from Africa in a past life and that he was spiritually aware enough to remember it. But this, for me, is when I first thought that maybe something was a little bit different about Theo. As Theo grew up, it became more and more clear that he was unique. He wondered why he couldn't stand up to pee. He never wanted to wear girls' bathing suits and constantly questioned why he had to wear bathing suit tops at all. He wore increasingly more masculine clothes and cut his hair short, and of course, he insisted on wearing boys' underwear. All of these behaviors, I would later find out, were hallmarks of transgender children. Theo was a homebody for as long as I could remember. Unlike his older sister, who never wanted to stay in our house, Theo never wanted to leave it. He was sleepover phobic, and while sure he tried a few sleepovers, I invariably had to pick him up not so late in the evening. He had a close neighborhood network of friends who he grew up and who loved him unconditionally, but he seemed contented with them and in no need of a larger social circle. Another behavior common to trans children, as they often are concerned about negative interactions and bullying or the possibility of having to change in front of others. I was in Chicago at a wedding when Theo was still quite young, and I saw a special on TV while working out. It was about a male-to-female transgender person. They mentioned some statistics about suicide rates in the transgender community. 40% of transgender persons attempt suicide, and over 90% of those did so before the age of 24. That is when I decided, no matter what Theo was, tomboy, gay, trans, or anything in between, I was going to support it, because the thought of Theo dead was far more devastating than the thought of walking him through transition. But don't get me wrong, it was terrifying to think of him being transgender and all the implications of it. Because as I dug deeper into the statistics, it seemed that successful transition was no guarantee of mental health stability or a safeguard against suicide. It was also frightening to think of him facing discrimination, or even worse, violence. By the time Theo was in second grade, it was very rare that anyone referred to him as she. People would ask me, "How old is he?" and tell me how handsome he was. When I explained that he was a girl, people often felt embarrassed and compelled to tell me stories of cousins or friends who were tomboys all their lives, and when they became teenagers, they couldn't find enough makeup to wear. I think this often had to do with people's own unease and their hopes to console me and reassure me, as if to say, "Don't worry, she's not trans." This, of course, was years before there would be a Caitlyn Jenner or any sort of national conversations about transgender persons or their rights. Back then, transgender was a word used in hushed voices or in disrespectful terms like tranny. There were no books to speak of, and I had no idea that there were others out there facing the same parenting choices. It was difficult not to question my own parenting choices. Well-educated, well-meaning, close family friends, and even Theo's father would tell me that Theo could not drive nor get his own clothes, and that since I was buying them, that I was only encouraging the behavior. They insisted that if I were firm with him about dressing in gender normative ways, that eventually he would acquiesce and fall into line. Just in case my tone of voice did not make it clear, please don't say this to anyone. And if you hear anyone say that to a parent of a potential transgender person, consider asking that person if they think that letting their child wear a dinosaur costume for long enough would convince said child that they were a dinosaur. This, of course, sounds ridiculous, but I have to tell you, that's what it felt like. And when we finally started seeing a therapist at the beginning of Theo's transition, I was deeply relieved to be reassured that I did not cause Theo to be trans, nor did my divorcing his dad, nor did any other life experience, because trans people are born trans. It is a family ritual in our house that I lay down with the kids at bedtime. This is a quiet time to share our day with each other and say things that might be too delicate or private for the dinner table conversation. Theo first came out to me one night, laying in his bed, talking to him about his day. He was about 11. He told me how one of his friends had asked him point blank, "Do you want to be a boy?" And then he fell silent. After what seemed like an eternity, as I realized what was about to happen, I asked, "Well, do you want to be a boy, that is?" Theo's answer was so quiet as to be almost imperceptible. "Yes, I do." He then proceeded to voice his concerns. What if this is just a phase I'm going through? What if I change my mind? How do I tell everyone? What will everyone say? We talked about what could be the next steps: therapist, endocrinologist, hormone blockers, etc. Then one final question came. "Mama, do you think God makes mistakes?" I swallowed back my tears because I have to tell you that one of the things I wanted so badly to give my children, above all things, was a loving and personal relationship with God, because, let's face it, life can be a bit of a storm, and a strong relationship with God is both shelter in that storm as well as FEMA for the cleanup and recovery. I knew that the transition would be fraught with challenges, and the last thing I wanted was for him to feel alienated from what I knew to be God's infinite love. So I said, "Nope, I don't think God makes mistakes. You just come some assembly required." Just like many of your Hanukkah toys that need batteries or assembling before you play with them, well, that's you. And just like those toys, when they are assembled, they can be your favorite things. When all of this is said and done, Theo, you're probably going to be one of God's favorite things. I wish I could say that this is when we moved on to Theo's transition and all lived happily ever after, but this was really the first coming out and was followed by many going back into the closet and a few other false starts over the course of the next 3 years. Finally, at about 14, he came out for what would be the last time and proceeded to begin living as a boy. Theo was lucky in many respects, as he came out to relatively wide acclaim. He was featured on the cover of City Magazine on Pride Week, and we threw him a birthday party where everyone was to come dressed as their favorite change, i.e. spare change or butterflies, or somebody came as a gremlin. We served tacos and hot dogs, and best of all, our closest friends were all in attendance. We had not lost a single solitary friend in this process. I was pretty busy patting myself on the back for what I thought was a really good job I had done with Theo, when I was blindsided about a year after Theo transitioned with a suicide attempt. I was incredulous. Suicide? Suicide? What about the tacos and the hot dogs and the magazine cover? But I love you and accept you. Isn't that enough? Can't you be safe? Well, it turns out that being able to transition just means you get to live in the house you always wanted to live in. It does not mean that you don't have any other problems ever again. Also, it does not mean that the process of transition is not difficult and full of compromises, not to mention when you add hormones to the hormone tsunami that is teenagehood, things can get a little volatile. All this to say that transitioning is a process, and it requires a lot of love and support and patience, lots and lots of patience. If God hates gays, it was a surprise to Theo. It would have been difficult to deny God's love for Theo in looking at his story. He always seemed to have something of a flamboyant, fabulous guardian angel on his shoulder. From growing up next door to a lesbian couple who sort of adopted Theo, to our loving neighborhood, to the fact that our synagogue, of all the synagogues in San Diego, happened to be home to not one, not two, but 3 trans teens, including Theo. Also, one of the endocrinologists that ran Rady's Children Gender Clinic happened to be a congregant of our synagogue. Funny story, When Theo had his bat mitzvah, because he had not yet come out to the public, Dr. Neufeld saw Theo, who was decked out in full-on suit and tie from Men's Warehouse. And he approached my ex-husband and I and just quietly handed us his card and said, "I think you'll need this." Also, at the temple where I attend services, before Theo had even come out to me, I met in a series of miraculous circumstances a pediatric endocrinologist just visiting from Canada. I didn't know she was this endocrinologist, and for some reason that I cannot explain to you, and I can only say was probably God, I began telling her about Theo, and she gave me so much of the information that would allow me to guide Theo knowledgeably through this transition. It always seemed that God was lifting the road up to meet us. So, some statistics for all of you. Clinical social worker Caitlin Ryan's Family Acceptance Project, which is in San Francisco, conducted the first study of the effect of family acceptance and rejection on the health, mental health and well-being of LGBT youth, including suicide, HIV, and homelessness. Their research shows that LGBT youths who experience high level of rejection from their families during adolescence, when compared with those young people who experience little or no rejection from parents and caregivers, were more than 8 times more likely to have attempted suicide, more than 6 times more likely to report high levels of depression, more than 3 times more likely to use illicit drugs, and more than 3 times more likely to be at high risk for HIV and STDs by the time they reach their 20s. Numerous studies have shown that LGBT youth have a higher rate of suicide attempts than do heterosexual youth. The Suicide Prevention Resources Center synthesized these studies and estimated that between 5 and 10% of LGBT youth, depending on the age and sex groups, have attempted suicide, a rate 1.5 to 3 times higher than heterosexual youth. More than 34,000 people die by suicide each year, making it the second leading cause of death among 15 to 24-year-olds, with lesbian, gay, and bisexual youth attempting suicide up to 4 times more than their heterosexual counterparts. It is difficult to know the exact suicide rates of the LGBT youth because sexuality and gender minorities are often hidden and even unknown, and birth or death certificates do not indicate people's sexuality. In terms of schools, research has found that the presence of gay-straight alliance in schools is associated with decreased suicide attempts, almost half of the suicide attempts for students who attend schools with GSAs. What can you do to help? As I mentioned, acceptance is key in the survival and well-being of these young people. So love your neighbor, right? There are several organizations that are instrumental in the LGBT community. The Trevor Project, you can look all of these up. The Trevor Project, the It Gets Better Project, the Q Card Project, StopBullying.gov has a specific component, a module just for LGBTs. The center here in Hillcrest, Trans Family Support System, and there's a lovely representative here for everybody to talk to, and PFLAG, which is Parents and Families of Lesbians and Gays. This was back before trans was a thing. And if anybody is asking, if you ever have somebody that's just telling you that their child has just told them, the book, The Transgender Child, A Handbook for Families and Professionals by Stephanie Bill and Rachel Pepper is an amazing Bible with so much information about transgender questions and answers that you might have, and some that you didn't even know you had. I wanted to thank you very much. This is an amazing, amazing thing to be witness to. There's a saying in Judaism that if you change the life of one person, you change the world in time. it's very obvious that you guys have a great deal to do with the good and the loving part of this earth, and I thank you deeply for that.